Section 8 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. I'd put in for an 8 o'clock call, but my sleep had been so sound and perfect that I was all slept out by 7:30. I was anxious to get going, so I dressed and shaved in a hurry and canceled the 8 o'clock call. Then I asked the operator to connect me with 913. A gruff, angry male voice snarled out of the earpiece at me. I began to apologize profusely, but the other guy slammed the phone down on the hook hard enough to make my ear ring. I jiggled my hook angrily, and when the operator answered, I told her that she'd miscued. She listened to my complaint and then replied in a pettish tone, "But I did ring 913, sir. I'll try again." I wanted to tell her to just try, that there was no again about it, but I didn't. I tried to dig through the murk to her switchboard, but I couldn't dig a foot through this area. I waited impatiently until she remade the connections at her switchboard, and I heard the burring of the phone as the other end rang. Then the same mad bull rage voice delivered a number of pointed comments about people who ring up honest citizens in the middle of the night, and he hung up again in the middle of my apology. I got irked again and demanded that the operator connect me with the registration clerk. To him I told my troubles. "One moment, sir," he said. A half-minute later he returned with, "Sorry, sir, there is no Pharaoh registered. Could I have misheard you?" "No, goddammit," I snarled. "It's Pharaoh. F as in Frank, A as in Arthur, double R as in Robert, O as in Oliver, and W as in Washington. I saw her register. I went with her and the bellhop to her room, number 913, and saw her installed. Then the same hop took me up to my room in 1224 on the 12th. There was another moment of silence. Then he said, "You're Mr. Cornell, registered in room 1224 last night approximately 4 minutes after midnight." "I know all about me. I was there and did it myself. And if I registered at 4 after midnight, Miss Pharaoh must have registered about 2 after midnight, because the ink was still wet on her card when I wrote my name. We came in together. We were traveling together. Now what gives?" "I wouldn't know, sir. We have no guest named Pharaoh." "See here," I snapped. "Did you ever have a guest named Pharaoh?" "Not in the records I have available at this desk. Perhaps in the past there may have been—" "Forget the past. What about the character in 913? The registration clerk returned and informed me coldly. "Room 913 has been occupied by a Mr. Horace Westfield for over 3 months, Mr. Cornell. There is no mistake." His voice sounded professionally sympathetic, and I knew that he would forget my troubles as soon as his telephone was put back on its hook. "Forget it," I snapped, and hung up angrily. Then I went towards the elevators, walking in a sort of dreamlike daze. There was a cold lump of something concrete hard beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. Wetness ran down my spine, and a drop of sweat dropped from my armpit and hit my body a few inches above my belt, like a pellet of icy hail. My face felt cold, but when I wiped it with the palm of a shaking hand, I found it beaded with an oily sweat. Everything seemed unreally horrifying. 9, I told the elevator operator in a voice that sounded far away and hoarse. I wondered whether this might not be a very vivid dream, and maybe if I went all the way back to my room, took a short nap, and got up to start all over again, I would awaken to honest reality. The elevator stopped at 9, and I walked the corridor that was familiar from last night. I rapped on the door of room 913. The door opened, and a big, stubble-faced gorilla gazed out and snarled at me. "Are you the persistent character?" "Look," I said patiently, "last night a woman friend of mine registered at this hotel, and I accompanied her to this door, number 913. Now—" A long, ape-like arm came out and caught me by the coat lapels. He hauled, and I went in fast. His breath was sour, and his eyes were bloodshot, and he was angry all the way through. His other hand caught me by the seat of the pants, and he danced me into the room like a jumping jack. "Friend," he ground out, "take a look. There ain't no woman in this room, see?" He whirled, carrying me off my feet. He took a lunging step forward and hurled me onto the bed, where I carried the springs deep down to bounce up and off and forward to come up flat against the far wall. I landed sort of spread-eagle flat and seemed to hang there before I slid down the wall to the floor with a meaty-sounding whoomp. Then, before I could collect my wits, or myself, he came over the bed in one long leap and had me hauled upright by the coat lapels again. The other hand was cocked back level with his shoulder. It looked the size of a 25-pound sack of flour and was probably as hard as set cement. "Steve," I told myself, "this time you're in for it." "All right," I said as apologetically as I knew how. "So I've made a bad mistake. I apologize. I'll also admit that you could wipe up the hotel with me, but do you have to prove it?" Mr. Horace Westfield's mental processes were not slow, cumbersome, and crude. He was as fast and hard on his mental feet as he was on his physical feet. He made some remarks about my intelligence, my upbringing, my parentage and its legal status, and my unwillingness to face a superior enemy. During this catalogue of my virtueless existence, he gandy-walked me to the door and opened it. He concluded his lecture by suggesting that in the future I accept anything that any registration clerk said as God-stated truth, and if I then held any doubts I should take them to the police. Then he hurled me out of the room by just sort of shoving me away. I sailed across the hall on my toes, backward, and slapped my frame flat again, and once more I hung against the wall until the kinetic energy had spent itself. Then I landed on wobbly ankles as the door to room 913 came closed with a violent slam. I cursed the habit of building hotels in dead areas, although I admitted that I'd steer clear of any hotel in a clear area myself. But I didn't need a clear area nor a sense of perception to inform me that room 913 was absolutely and totally devoid of any remote sign of female habitation. In fact, I gathered the impression that for all of his brute strength and virile masculinity, Mr. Horace Westfield hadn't entertained a woman in that room since he'd been there. There was one other certainty. It was impossible for any agency short of sheer fairyland magic to have produced overnight a room that displayed its long-term occupancy by a not-too-immaculate character. That distinctive sour smell takes a long time to permeate the furnishings of any decent hotel. I wondered why a joint as well-kept as this one would put up with a bird as careless of his person as Mr. Horace Westfield. So I came to the reluctant conclusion that room 913 was not occupied by Nurse Farrow, but I was not yet convinced that she was totally missing from the premises. Instead of taking the elevator, I took to the stairs and tried the 8th. My perception was not too good for much in this murk, but I was mentally sensitive to Nurse Farrow, and if I could get close enough to her I might be able to perceive some trace of her even through the deadness. I put my forehead against the door of room 813 and drew a blank. I could dig no farther than the inside of the door. If Farrow were in 813, I couldn't dig a trace of her. So I went to 713 and tried there. I was determined to try every 13th room on every floor, but as I was standing with my forehead against the door to room 413, someone came up behind me quietly and asked in a rough voice, "Just what do you think you're doing, mister?" His dress indicated house dick, but of course I couldn't dig the license in his wallet any more than he could read my mental, "None of your business, Flatfoot." I said. "I'm looking for a friend." "You'd better come with me," he said flatly. "There's been complaints." "Yeah," I growled. "Maybe I made one of them myself." "Want to start something?" he snapped. I shrugged, and he smiled. It was a stony smile, humorless as a crevasse in a rock face. He kept that professional-type smile on his face until we reached the manager's office. The manager was out, but one of the assistant managers was in his desk. The little sign on the desk said, "Henry Walton, Assistant Manager." Mr. Walton said coldly, "What seems to be the trouble, Mr. Cornell?" I decided to play it just as though I were back at the beginning again. "Last night," I explained very carefully, "I checked into this hotel. I was accompanied by a woman companion, a registered nurse, Miss Gloria Farrow. She registered first, and we were taken by one of your bellboys to rooms 913 and 1224, respectively. I went with Miss Farrow to 913 and saw her enter. Then the bellhop escorted me to 1224 and left me for the night. This morning I can find no trace of Miss Farrow anywhere in this flea bag." He bristled at the derogatory title, but he covered it quickly. "Please be assured that no one connected with this hotel has any intention of confusing you, Mr. Cornell." "I'm tired of playing games," I snapped. "I'll accept your statement so far as the management goes, but someone is guilty of fouling up your registration lists." "That's rather harsh," he replied coldly. "Falsifying or tampering with hotel registration lists is illegal. What you've just said amounts to libel or slander, you know." "Not if it's true." I half expected Henry Walton to backwater fast, but instead he merely eyed me with the same expression of distaste that he might have used upon finding half of a fuzzy caterpillar in his green salad. As cold as a cake of carbon dioxide snow, he said, "Can you prove this, Mr. Cornell?" "Your night crew." "You've been giving us a bit of trouble this morning," he informed me. "So I've taken the liberty of calling in the night crew for you." He pressed a button and a bunch came in and lined up as if for formal inspection. "Boys," said Walton quietly, "suppose you tell us what you know about Mr. Cornell's arrival here last night?" They nodded their heads in unison. "Wait a minute," I snapped. "I want a reliable witness to listen to this. In fact, if I could, I'd like to have their stories made under oath." "You'd like to request a formal charge? Perhaps of kidnapping or maybe illegal restraint?" "Just get me an impartial witness," I told him sourly. "Very well." He picked up his telephone and spoke into it. We waited a few minutes, and finally a very prim young woman came in. She was followed by a uniformed policeman. She was carrying one of those sub-miniature silent typewriters, which she set up on its little stand with a few efficient motions. "Miss Mason is our certified public stenographer," he said. "Officer, I'll want your signature on her copy when we're finished. This is a simple routine matter, but it must be legal to the satisfaction of Mr. Cornell. Now, boys, go ahead and explain. Give your name and position first for Miss Mason's record." It was then that I noticed that the night crew had arranged themselves in chronological order. The elderly gent spoke first. He'd been the night doorman, but now he was stripped of his admiral's gold braid, and he looked just like any other sleepy man of middle age. "George Comstock," he announced. "Doorman. As soon as I saw the car angling out of the traffic, I pressed the call button for a bellboy. Peter Wright came out and was standing in readiness by the time Mr. Cornell's car came to a stop by the curb. Johnny Olson was out next, and after Peter had taken Mr. Cornell's bag, Johnny got into Mr. Cornell's car and took off for the hotel garage." Walton interrupted. Let each man tell what he did himself. No prompting, please. Well, then, you've heard my part in it. Johnny Olson took off in Mr. Cornell's car, and Peter Wright took off with Mr. Cornell's bag, and Mr. Cornell followed Peter. The next man in line, at a nod from the assistant manager, stepped forward about a half a pace and said, "I'm Johnny Olson. I followed Peter right out of the door, and after Peter had collected Mr. Cornell's bag, I got in Mr. Cornell's car and took it to the hotel garage." The third was Peter Wright, the bellhop. "I carried his bag to the desk and waited until he registered. Then we went up to room 1224. I opened the door, lit the lights, opened the window and stuff. Mr. Cornell tipped me $5 and I left him there, alone." "I'm Thomas Booth, the elevator operator. I took Mr. Cornell and Peter Wright to the 12th. Peter said I should wait because he wouldn't be long, and so I waited on the 12th until Peter got back. That's all." "I'm Doris Casbury, the night telephone operator. Mr. Cornell called me about 15 minutes after 12 and asked me to put him down for a call at 8 o'clock this morning. Then he called at about 7:30 and said that he was already awake and not to bother." Henry Walton said, "That's about it, Mr. Cornell." "But—" The policeman looked puzzled. "What is the meaning of all this? If I'm to witness any statements like these, I'll have to know what for." Walton looked at me. I couldn't afford not to answer. Wearily I said, "Last night I came in here with a woman companion, and we registered in separate rooms. She went into 913, and I waited until she was installed, and then went to my own room on the 12th. This morning there is no trace of her." I went on to tell him a few more details, but the more I told him, the more he lifted his eyebrows. "Done any drinking?" he asked me curtly. "No." "Certain?" "Absolutely." Walton looked at his crew. They burst into a chorus of, "Well, he was steady on his feet," and "he didn't seem under the influence," and a lot of other statements, all generally indicating that for all they knew I could have been gassed to the ears, but one of those rare guys who don't show it. The policeman smiled thinly. "Just why was this registered nurse traveling with you?" I gave them the excuse-type statement, the one about the accident and that I felt that I was still a bit on the rocky side and so forth. About all I did for that was to convince the policeman that I was not a stable character. His attitude seemed to indicate that any man traveling with a nurse must either be physically sick or maybe mentally out of tune. Then, with a sudden thought, I whirled on Johnny Olson. "Will you get my car?" I asked him. He nodded after a nod from Walton. I said, "There's plenty of evidence in my car. In the meantime, let's face one thing, officer. I've been accused of spinning a yarn. I'd hardly be demanding witnesses if I weren't telling the truth. I was standing beside Miss Farrow when she signed the register, complete with the RN title. It's too bad that hotels have taken to using card files instead of the old registration book. Cards are so easy to misplace." Walton cut in angrily. "If that's an accusation, I'm inclined to see that you make it in a court of law." The policeman looked calm. "I'd take it easy, Mr. Cornell. Your story is not corroborated, but the employees of the hotel bear one another out, and from the record it would appear that you were under the eyes of at least two of them from the moment your car slowed down in front of the main entrance up to the time that you were escorted to your room." "I object to being accused of complicity in a kidnapping," put in the assistant manager. "I object to being accused of mental incompetence," I snapped. "Why do we stand around accusing people back and forth when there's evidence if you'll only uncover it?" We stood there glaring at one another. The air grew tense. The only ones in the place who did not have chips on their shoulders were the policeman and the certified stenographer, who was clicking her silent keys in lightning manner, taking down every comment as it was uttered. Eventually Olson returned to put an end to the thick silence. "Your car's outside," he told me angrily. "Fine," I said. "Now we'll go outside and take a look. You'll find plenty of traces of Miss Farrow's having been there. Officer, are you telepath or perceptive?" "Perceptive," he said, "but not in here." "How far out does this damned dead area extend?" I asked Walton. "About halfway across the sidewalk." "Okay, so let's all go." We traipsed out to the curb. Miss Mason brought her little Silent along, slipping the stand high up so that she could type from an erect position. We lined up along the curb, and I looked into my car with a triumphant feeling. And then that cold chill congealed my spine again. My car was clean and shining. It had been washed and buffed and polished until it looked as new as the day I picked it out on the salesroom floor. Walton looked blank, and I whipped a thought at him. "Damn telepath." He nodded perceptibly and said smoothly, "I'm rather sorry we couldn't find any fingerprints, because now, you see," and here he turned to the policeman and went on, "Mr. Cornell will now accuse us of having washed his car to destroy the evidence. However, you'll find that as a general policy of the hotel, the car washing is performed as a standard service. In fact, if any guest parks his car in our garage and his car is not rendered spick and span, someone is going to get fired for negligence." So that was that. I took a fast look around because I knew that I had to get out of there fast. If I remained to carry on any more argument, I'd be tapped for being a nuisance and jugged. I had no doubt at all that the whole hotel staff were all involved in Nurse Farrow's disappearance. But they'd done their job in such a way that if the question were pushed hard, I would end up answering formal charges, the topmost of which might be murder and concealment of the body. I could do nothing by sitting in jail. This was the time to get out first and worry about Farrow later. So I opened the car door and slipped in. I fiddled with the so-called glove compartment and opened it. The maps were all neatly stacked and all the flub had been cleaned out. I fumbled inside and dropped a couple of road maps to the floor, and while I was down picking them up, I turned the ignition key which Olson had left plugged in the lock. I took off with a jerk and howl of tires. There was the sudden shrill of a police whistle, but it was stopped after one brief blast. As I turned the corner, I caught a fast backwards dig at them. They were filing back into the hotel. I did not believe that the policeman was part of the conspiracy, but I was willing to bet that Walton was going to slip the policeman a box of fine cigars as a reward for having helped them to get rid of a very embarrassing screwball. End of Chapter 8.